Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Food Equality Initiative's conversation on food laws, an introduction to changemaking. I'm Karen Palmer, your moderator. I am the principal of Karen Palmer Coaching and also a food allergy parent and advocate. And I welcome you all. Very happy you can join us. Food Equality Initiative is the nation's leading organization working to increase access to allergy-friendly and gluten-free foods for the individuals who need them most. On everyone's behalf, I'd like to thank the staff of FEI for making today's conversation possible, and also to thank FEI's founder, Emily Brown, for creating this series of discussions designed to educate and empower the food allergy and celiac community. Over the next hour, we will discuss ongoing developments in the areas of the law concerning food allergy and celiac disease, and what it takes to get legislation proposed, created, and enforced. We'll also pay special attention to what you in the audience can do to become effective advocates and partners in the process of making change. So to get us started, I'd like to briefly introduce our guests. Jen Jobrack, who is the principal of the organization Food Allergy Pros. Mary Vargas, a partner in the legal firm of Stein and Vargas. Joey Salmingo, founder of the advocacy organization Fate Initiative. And Representative Jonathan Carroll, state representative of the 57th House District of the Illinois Legislature. So we'll begin with Representative Carroll, and I want to give you all a little bit more background on what he's been doing. He introduced and ensured the passage of HB 102, the Childhood Anaphylactic Policy Act, which was signed into Illinois state law 1 week ago today. It will require the Illinois Department of Health to establish anaphylaxis policies and procedures for school districts and daycare settings. And it's based on the New York state law known as Elijah's Law, which requires that early education programs in New York follow protocols to prevent, recognize, and respond quickly to life-threatening anaphylactic reactions. So Illinois has become a leader around food allergy safety thanks to several bills that have been shepherded through by Representative Carroll, including EpiPen availability for children 18 and under, and labeling for sesame, which thankfully has also now been signed into federal law earlier this year under the FASTER Act. We really appreciate your joining us today, Representative Carroll.
Thank you for having me.
So congratulations on this most recent legislative success. That's a lot of hard work. How did you first become aware of Elijah's Law, and what made you believe that you could have success with getting similar legislation passed in Illinois?
So, I took this office in 2017, and so when I first took the job, question was proposed to me like, well, what are you passionate about? And I said, I have a daughter with food allergies, and I find that we don't do enough. So it kind of was one of those things where, I guess when you're on the dance floor, you better not to dance, I guess, a little bit. So I sat there and I came up with ideas like, why are we not doing this? Like, if, for example, you mentioned the EpiPen legislation, was me going to the pharmacist like, why am I being charged all kinds of money for my daughter's EpiPens when she's a child? And this is a life-saving medication. So we wanted to work with things that are like common sense approaches to creating a better world for kids with food allergies. So the EpiPen legislation that you mentioned was something that we had worked on in collaboration with the insurance companies to make sure that at least children of under 18 can have coverage in that. I mean, I'd love to cover everyone, but let's start with children. So it's kind of finding that balance so that there's that part of it. And then talk about Elijah's Law. So when I first took the job, I remember reading the article. This is the terrible article about Elijah Silvera, who died in a daycare because he was given a grilled cheese sandwich when he had a dairy allergy. And the school really had nothing to do with it. And I was just outraged because I said, I just can't believe that this would happen, especially in 2017. Fast forward a few years later, I was at a fair conference in Washington, D.C., and I met Thomas Silvera and his lovely wife, and we had a chance to talk a little bit. And then I figured out, wait, these are the people who I read the article about. So he talked about how in New York he was able to pass Elijah's Law and how much that really meant to him and his family and how their real mission was to get this done in all 50 states. Well, the impulsive ADHD in me came out and said, well, hell, I'll get that done in Illinois. So I took the law from them. Unfortunately, we had the pandemic, which kind of slowed down the legislative process, but I really made that bill one of my priority bills last year. And, we were fortunate to have full unanimous support both in the House and Senate on that legislation because I think people recognized its importance. The other thing too is, I've really done a lot of work in this area too, is I really try to educate my colleagues on issues and explain to them why these are important. Like a good example on the Sesame bill was I had a Republican colleague. I'm a Democrat. I had a Republican colleague, not that we're holding it against anyone. It's just, and this person didn't quite understand why this was important. And once I sat down for 2 minutes and explained to him why, he became a huge advocate and a real help in me passing legislation. So it's really just kind of like been a mission just to both educate my colleagues on it and really push Illinois to the forefront of this area. And, you know, we have people like Jen in Illinois who are great advocates in this area who've done a lot of work in it as well. So as we continue to go through this, it's so important to have someone that understands the issue, someone who's willing to educate colleagues on it and work through it. And so as a kind of funny one here, we have a group of about like 5 or 6 of us now in the House of Representatives that we call the EPI Friends. And our goal is for food allergy safety and passing food allergy legislation. And you know, I know you mentioned celiac disease. Another bill that I worked on this year that was a little more under the radar is labeling for gluten on medications, because I think that's become a big issue. So we passed that law, and really with the hopes, like the Sesame law, of raising more awareness on the issue and hopefully having the federal government take notice of it. So we're doing great things here in Illinois. We're really at the forefront of food allergy work. Again, we have a lot of advocates that help us in that sphere. You know, I'm trying to be as modest as possible, but I think having someone like as a parent who understands the issues, who can educate on that is really helpful as well. And I'm super excited.
Actually, if I might hop in here for a second, because you have, you know, stressed, you know, very forcefully that education here is the key, that's been really important for your colleagues who may not have a personal connection to this issue in any way. In thinking about people who might be watching this webinar right now and what kind of education they need to do, how does someone even come to a person like you, get to a person like you, to be able to propose legislation or to ask for your support? What concrete steps do people need to take?
Well, you know, I think it's funny because you'll ask people, who's your state rep? And sometimes people don't know as much. And it's like, I think, first of all, educating yourself on who the locally elected officials are, coming to them with, you know, your concerns. And I think as we start that process, then you'll figure out who's good at what. So I'll give you a good example. So one of my colleagues, a farmer from downstate Illinois, came to me and he says, hey, he said, I had a constituent come to me with a very interesting thing. I said, okay, go on. He says, why are we not labeling pet foods for peanuts? He says, we label everything else. He says, but we have, you know, there's peanuts and animal treats and feed and stuff. He says, so why are we not doing that? And I said, well, his name's Dan Swanson. And I said, Dan, I said, well, let's work on that. And so we filed a bill for that purpose, to do that. So a lot of the stuff, just knowing your elected officials, reaching out to them with ideas, and then knowing who we connect with. Like, you know, there's certain issues that I know my colleagues are better on than me. So if I hear from a constituent, I might be like, well, I'm going to reach out to, you know, Representative so-and-so, who's a real expert in that area. And I think that's really one of the things, is knowing who your elected officials are, and then making sure that your elected officials continue to maintain those relationships. So I guess for good or for bad, I have the reputation as the food allergy guy. So I think people like bringing me these things, but I'm happy to do it. It's really helpful to kind of have that point person. And again, I'm really on a bipartisan basis. We've really done some tremendous things in Illinois, and it's really because of the conversations we have with colleagues. And I'm super excited about the animal one, because I think that's one that we overlooked a little bit. And honestly, if there's other ideas that people have, I think just reach out to us and put it on our radar.
So this is a great, point to be able to say. So folks, reach out. Exactly what do they do? You're a busy guy. You're probably not in the office a lot, COVID or not, because you're out there doing the people's business. So how does someone literally get in touch with someone who can get something in front of you? And how do they need to prepare once they can actually, be able to meet up with you?
Well, that's a great question. So, I think the first thing is, again, educate yourself on who your locally elected officials are. Find out who has what role, to know like who your state representative is, who your state senator is, and just reach out to their office and just say like, look, this is something that we're dealing with, and this is something that I'd like to have a conversation with you about. I mean, I make myself available to my constituents. I was having constituent meetings all morning. So, I mean, that's part of my job. And I think in the process of doing that, like a good representative, I can't speak for everyone, but I mean, I would certainly welcome someone to come to my office and have this conversation with me, because I think it's important that you're heard. It's important that this information is presented to you in a way that's, usable. And then, again, I think just preparing the issue, like, look, this is the problem that we have. These are some solutions that we have, and kind of let the legislators do their job from that point forward. I found that in some cases, when you're passionate about an issue, and I get it, and you have a chance to get in front of someone you think can make a difference, the enthusiasm can somehow take over. And it's probably a little bit more of like being more calculated and more understanding. A lot of legislation is pushing boulders up hills. I mean, it doesn't just happen. There's a lot of moving parts to it. So understand that when you propose something, it may take a couple years. It may take, longer than you want, but at least if it's on people's radar, we can work on that. And a lot, again, I mentioned Elijah's Law is a good example. Is, I wanted to get that passed 2 years ago, but obviously the pandemic kind of forced it differently. But we were able to get it done this year, and having colleagues having faith that you present good legislation that helps people, having that information available to you. Having all those things, I think, really helps. And again, the other thing is I stress two other things: be patient and be kind.
Well, that's, at the heart of everything, because it's a lot easier to influence people when they actually want to sit down and talk with you. So I think that's a great reminder. And I would just, come back and say, if we're looking at specific steps, what it sounds like you're offering the audience is, number one, find out who the person is in the office of the person that you want to talk to, who can actually put you on the agenda. So in your office, who would that person be?
Well, I have a chief of staff, so he would generally set up appointments, but I mean, if you email me too, I guess sometimes I annoy him because I sometimes try to do more than one role, but generally speaking, we'll find time to talk to you. Again, you have to be patient. It's not, it's there's a lot of people that want to do those kinds of things.
The last thing I would love to ask you, because you've talked about the importance of, Thomas Silvera, who was an inspiration to you in pushing forward a very important piece of legislation for your state. If I remember correctly, he testified as a witness for, the early committee hearings on the Childhood Anaphylactic Policy Act. What kind of lessons can people take, those people who want to become advocates in their own states, from the kind of presentation he made and the collaboration he had with you?
Well, and that's a great point. So the first part of it is, I mean, I knew going into that meeting, I had the votes to get the bill out of committee. I mean, I'll give you my process. And again, this is what I would think a good legislator would do is, I generally talk to the members of the committee, say, look, I'm going to present this bill. Do you have any questions? And most people are like, no, I think this is okay. But I wanted to bring Thomas into that committee hearing because I think I wanted people to hear why this was important and really why I'm bringing this bill forward. And I remember I was getting texts from my colleagues like put me on the bill immediately, and we have to make sure we do this because I think it's important that they heard it from someone who directly was impacted by that. So there's really good ways of testifying. And again, the way you testify is like, this is why we're going to do this. This is how we want to do this, and kind of just laying out your story. And I think through that process, we'll find that, like when you bring someone like Thomas in, and again, I don't know, for those in here who have not heard Thomas speak, and he's a heck of a guy, and his passion behind the issue and his real dedication to this is really just, is contagious. No pun intended in the food allergy thing, but he is very contagious in how he does things. And I think people gravitate towards that because they say, like, this guy really comes from a place of the heart, but doesn't come at a place of being like belligerent or aggressive, more of like educational. And I think that really helps so much with this process. So I'm super excited that there's someone like Thomas out there who's another voice in the room. And again, if you're not in Illinois or New York, you need to reach out to your locally elected officials and get this on the books. I mean, this is their passion. And I'm happy to help any legislator that wants to do this nationally to try to get it done. So I think that's really where Thomas's value comes in, is just we're humanizing the situation.
Well, thank you so much for spelling all of that out. And, for folks who are interested in, taking a closer look at the legislation in Illinois, that is HB 102, the Childhood Anaphylactic Policy Act. And in New York, it's known as Elijah's Law. You can Google and lots of information will come up on both. Representative Carroll, thank you so much for, helping us to kind of put all of this in context, for allowing people to get a window into how legislation can be made and how people can be effective in approaching their legislators for support. So we wish you much success in your future efforts on behalf of our community.
Thank you very
Representative
much.
Carroll, thank you. Representative Carroll's going to drop off, but we are going to continue the conversation and move a bit more towards the idea of citizen advocacy and continue on with Jen Jobrack. Jen is the principal of Food Allergy Pros, a firm helping schools, colleges, restaurants, camps, and other entities develop best practices for people with food allergies. She spent almost a decade running advocacy for food allergy research and education, known as FAIR to many of us here. During this time, she led and worked on more than 100 pieces of legislation addressing the safety and inclusion of people with food allergies. So good morning, or good afternoon, I should say, Jen. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much. So, Karen, I'll just start by saying that what I was asked to talk about today is really two things. One is the tools you need to know, things you need to know as you embark on becoming an advocate, as well as to touch on the highlights. We've made a tremendous amount of progress on food allergy law, policy, and regulation, certainly in the last decade and a half. And so there's a lot of good news to report. There's also a lot more work to be done, and there's no shortage of work for anyone who's interested in advocacy. So I'm going to kind of weave together how you do it and what's been done and where we need to go. So, and I'm going to piggyback a little bit on what Representative Carroll just talked about, because he really talked about kind of what happens when you reach out to set up a meeting. I want to take you back a few steps earlier than that, to when you first become informed about the need for an issue. So it's important to remember that advocacy can happen at the individual level, such as developing a plan to accommodate your child at school. It can happen at the community level, such as helping your school develop a building-wide plan to handle food allergy. It can happen at the state level, like pushing your state to require food allergy plans in all schools across the state. And it can happen at the federal level, such as financial appropriations for schools that prioritize food allergy preparedness. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm really just going to talk about laws and regulations and not on the advocacy for the individual family. Most people get involved in advocacy because they see something not being done, or they see something being done in a way that's not to their liking. This is a perfectly good reason to take action, but so many folks don't know where to get started. And if there's one takeaway from my talk, it's this: take a deep breath. Take the time to research and learn about the issue. What is the practice or policy that you want to create or change? And who has to be persuaded or compelled to change it? Representative Carroll just touched on that. Sometimes it's a state issue, sometimes it's not. So here are some ways you can get started. First, ask yourself the following questions about whatever it is you want to have happen that you don't see happening. Is the matter you're looking at already handled by a law that may not be being enforced? Is the thing you're interested in an optional practice, such as stock epinephrine, which we'll get into shortly, where schools have the option of stocking it or not, and for whatever reason your school has decided not to? Is the matter you're looking at under the jurisdiction of the federal government, the state government, local government? Because before you pick up the phone and reach out to a chief of staff or a state representative, it's important to know, is that the right person? And or is that the layer of decision-making that you need to impact? So the good news is the internet has a variety of information, as do most of the food allergy patient advocacy groups. Social media has been a good place just to get your feet wet in what's worked in people's states, what hasn't worked in people's states. There is no shortage of information on every state has a legislative website, which has varying degrees of sophistication in their search functions for purposes of looking up existing statute, existing regulation. You should assume that whatever is making you unhappy has made other people unhappy. So bringing in others who are like-minded is very important. And this is where school parent groups, this is where social media groups, this is where support groups, to the extent that they're still working during COVID in the food allergy space, can all be helpful in finding people in your community who share your concerns. And it's also important to know what impediments there have been to prevent the changes that you wish to see if they've already been tried before. Is it
and
a matter
if I can hop in for a second,
please.
What I'm thinking is, this is wonderful because you're laying out the steps that people need to, actually consider so that they know who, where, what am I actually trying to accomplish.
Right.
There's a basic level of understanding that seems to have a lot of confusion around what the laws might be. You've spoken in the past about the difference between laws and regulations and what kind of laws, because I think when people hear the idea that a law has been passed, that means, well, this is the kind of thing, if somebody breaks the law, they can go to jail or there's a fine. When we talk about laws around food allergy and celiac, what do we mean?
So that's a great question, because in many instances, the consequences either for choose, let me back up. Many of the state laws that have been passed around the country are laws that permit people to do things. They are not laws that require people to do things. So let me give you an example of a requirement, an example of a permission. Every state in the country requires schools to permit students to carry their own epinephrine. New York was the last state to adopt this law in 2014. With that, this means that by law, your child, if you choose, if it is appropriate, may self-carry, and the school cannot object to it. But sometimes the laws are written in such a way that the school has wiggle room. Could be an age or developmental issue that may preclude the child being an appropriate self-carrier. But the law is in place, right? So that's a case of a matter of a requirement. So that's self-carrying of epinephrine. For stocking of epinephrine, this is epinephrine that would be available in schools for use mostly on children without a prior food allergy or bee sting or latex diagnosis. Or in many cases, it could be for whatever reason the child does not have epinephrine, prescribed epinephrine with them in the building for a variety of reasons. 37 states permit schools to stock epinephrine. Only 12 require their public schools to stock epinephrine. And if you're doing the math, that means there's one state that has neither. And if people want to Google it and put it in the chat, I'll be very impressed. But this means that in 37 states, you may be in a state that permits your school to stock epi, but they've chosen not to. And so then if that's the case, if you want your school to stock epinephrine, you first need to understand what's the law in your state, right? Are you dealing with a state that requires it, in which case the school is breaking the law, and I'll come back to that in a minute, or are you in a state where the school could do it, it doesn't have to, and there's really no compunction to do it except for the efforts and clamor of parents and members of the community. Regarding the requirement, the laws that require stock epi, regrettably, there's not a lot of consequence if they don't. And I'm not really aware of any state that says a school will, get reduced funding, or somebody will be, certainly nobody will go to prison. So it's really a matter of, and in some cases, regrettably, there's also not a lot of rigorous reporting requirements. In Illinois, where I live, a school that chooses to stock epinephrine has to report that decision. But many places, that's not the case. So
and if I could jump back in here for a second, because what this is bringing up, you've made a couple of really critical points. Number one, you as the advocate, the onus is on you to dig and find out what's going on around the particular law you want to create or around the situation you want to remedy. It's always going to be on you first to do due diligence. Second of all, you got to figure out where is the missing piece. If there is in fact a law or a statute on the books, then you actually have to figure out, okay, what part of that could I fill? If it's a budget issue, I mean, like you're talking about, maybe the school doesn't actually have, money allocated. That means I got to figure out, that's when I might call a representative and say, could you help get this money allocated so our schools can stock the epi?
That's right.
If we haven't had the money in the budget to train people at the school level, there are places that could actually help people get that kind of training made available at a reduced price or pro bono. So figuring out, not just, as you point out, being accurate about who to go to, but then where does the system that's in place fall short for you? That seems really important.
It's critically important that you're spending your energies in the most efficient way possible. And if I may add, I see this in social media and the rooms that I'm in, the groups that I'm in. There's a desire for parents to say, well, I'll just, I'm going to stick with stock epinephrine. Well, I'll just get a prescription and I'll donate it to the school and it'll all be fine and they'll have it. The quick fix isn't really the sustainable goal that you're looking for. You want the school culture to adopt the importance of this as a practice, and you want people to be trained in how it's used. If you donate a couple of auto injectors and they sit in a drawer and no one knows how to use them and no one feels comfortable using them, and they don't even know that they are indemnified if they do use them, then you really haven't accomplished very much. And that's why you have to take that's why the deep breath matters, right? And to your point, Karen, who are the decision makers? Where are the impediments? What is the hole you're trying to fill? Who are the other people around you who would like to work with you to fill in that hole?
So I could go on here forever because we could
There's
do
a lot
like
more,
an entire thing. I want to put a pin in it and come back in group discussion because this is really news you can use. So what I want to do now is to be able to shift the discussion a little bit and bring Mary in to be able to take a look at what the landscape looks like from the perspective of somebody who's actually practicing law in this area. And so Mary Vargas is a founding partner of the law firm Stein and Vargas LLP, where she educates people, through lots of national appearances, but her primary function is to engage in nationwide impact litigation on behalf of individuals with disabilities, and has won some very important, victories in that arena, including for people with food allergies and celiac disease. So she was the recipient of the 2017 FAIR Award, the Vision Award, and the Eagle Award for groundbreaking disability rights litigation. She's also the mother of 3 boys, including 1 son with food allergies and celiac disease. So thank you, Mary. I know people are going to be very curious to hear from your point of view. First of all, you have had the opportunity to bring a variety of cases involving food allergy and celiac disease into court, and you've been able to achieve successful results on a number of them. What do you actually look for when you decide whether or not you're going to take a case?
So litigation in an area of law that's new or emerging, which food allergies and celiac certainly was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I want to say we've maybe in the last year or 2 started to arrive. But litigation is kind of like building a house, and you can't put the windows into the house until you put the foundation in. So in terms of looking at what kind of holes there are, in what ways people are falling through cracks, in what ways people in the food allergy community or the celiac community are being denied access, we need to look at what is the foundational level. What is our first step? What problem do we need to fix first? And the problem first in food allergy and celiac litigation was having it recognized that these were disabilities under federal law. And that's something that I think we have successfully done. I think that's very often well established now, and that's not really where the fight is. That was our foundation, and we've succeeded there. And so then what's the next step? What's the next issue? More so, there are 2 things that are really critically important to me. One is when somebody comes to us with an experience and wants to litigate their rights, usually under federal law in this arena, I want to know if they can tell their story in a way that people care about. There are so many things competing for our attention. In the world we live in now, we are emotionally and mentally and physically exhausted most of the time. And it's hard to care about everything. we need to have somebody who can stand up to questioning, who can tell what is often a very intense, difficult personal experience, not from a place of anger, but from a place of vulnerability, from a place of integrity, and can really explain what happened to them, much as Representative Carroll was saying, in a way that causes people to care and to want to respond, whether that's a jury or whether that's judges. I think it's really the same consideration. And then the last thing for me, as a firm, we get people coming to us every day. We cannot take every case. We cannot take every time there's a violation of law. And for me and for my law partner, we look at, is this a case we want to work on at 3 a.m. when we might be sleeping? And that sort of piggybacks on, can the person tell their story? Because if they've caught us, if they've made us feel that this really has the potential to make the world better for people with food allergies and celiac disease, then yeah, I'll work on it at 3 o'clock in the morning, and that's the case that we'll take.
How important is the scope of whatever the issue is that you choose to, go forward with, in terms of the people that it will affect?
That's a good question. Right now, there aren't a lot of lawyers doing this work. I could probably count them on less than one hand. Mm-hmm. And so I feel that I have a responsibility to focus on the issues that will help the most people, that are the kind of issues that will strengthen the law and create equal access for everybody. We don't do class actions. We do focus on individual cases where winning that individual case will have broad impact on others. So while somebody might come to us and say, my child is going into kindergarten and I need to have this accommodation for them in the classroom. As a parent who's had 504 plans for my kids, believe me, I understand that's critically important and will provide informal advocacy help, but we are not going to litigate that. We need to look at where we can focus our resources that can have the broadest impact on the most number of people. And often, as important as K through 12 issues are, the impact is very much housed around one family. It does not translate into fixing a problem for the broader community.
So the bar that you set is that it needs to affect the broadest possible swath of the community in order to have the impact that would allow you to want to move forward and bring it to court.
Right, and part of that is listening and being in touch with the community. I think it's really important when someone identifies an issue like Jen was talking about. You can feel intensely motivated personally to take something on, but it's really important to have the humility to look around and see what other people are doing, what other people know, what other people might say that would maybe shape or change your approach or the issue as you see it, and to really work in concert with others. None of us can do this alone, and we really need to make sure that we've informed ourselves and stay informed on what issues really matter to our community, and to really put our weight behind those issues where we can.
As you've mentioned, you're a food allergy parent as well as an attorney. What are the most important things that parents need to realize if, you accept their case and you do choose to move forward? What do they need to keep in mind during the process?
It's incredibly difficult. It is incredibly difficult to be a plaintiff in civil rights litigation, just as parents often feel so isolated, as family members of people with food allergies feel isolated, that culturally people don't understand the burdens, the challenges, the barriers. That is intensified when you are the plaintiff. You not only have the defense lawyers looking to find weaknesses in your story or place blame on you, or question your motives. Very often, the public at large now has direct access through social media, and you better believe that these plaintiffs, they read what people say about them online. And it's incredibly difficult. We had a situation where we represented a really courageous young man in a food allergy civil rights matter. His entire family, including him, suffered consequences for having the courage to advocate for themselves and for those who came after them. It impacted his ability to be a part of social events. It impacted whether he was welcome at local gatherings. It impacted when they went to the supermarket. It is incredibly difficult to be the one who speaks up and asks for better. So it's important to know that it's hard for the person who takes on that challenge, but it's also really important for the community of folks who care about those with food allergies and celiac to really see how vulnerable somebody is when they stand up and say, we all deserve better, and to really have their back and think with caution before questioning their conduct in social media in a way. The whole community, I've heard Robin O'Brien talks about scaffolding, and I love that analogy. We need to scaffold each other. It's not just the person who's leading the charge, it's all of the rest of us and how we come to cheer them on and support them and have their backs. And that is an incredibly important part of litigation that is never seen.
No, I mean, and thank you so much for, going into the detail you did on that, because I think the message becomes very clear that this is civil rights litigation, and people forget that this is civil rights. And if we look at the other great battles that have taken place, in our country here in the US, in order to make that type of legislation real, people get, more of an idea of what it requires of the people who move forward, who, again, are really enduring a tremendous amount of, pain in many cases to make this happen. I certainly hope that in the cases of all of your clients, they believe it's worth what they went through, because there's no way to say how much we appreciate the sacrifices that have been made on behalf of the community. I could also keep you here for several hours, but I want to bring Joey in and talk a little bit about life from the perspective of a citizen advocate. Joey Salmingo is a television presenter and interviewer. Joey works both in Canada and the United States, hence his absolutely fabulous background. He came to his on-air career through 2 decades in the food service industry as a chef, as a management consultant, a retail expert, and also spent a lot of time on the other side of the camera as a production sound mixer, coordinator, and film producer. So, Joey is here in his capacity as the founder of the advocacy organization Fate Initiative, and we are so pleased to have you here.
Thank you so much, Karen, and everyone else for having me here. Yeah, despite the volume I can achieve with my hair, I've worn many hats throughout my career. I always like to say that.
Well, I think, in your case, the richness of your background, has brought a lot to your work as an advocate. But I want to make note of the fact that you were moved to found Fate Initiative after a tragic loss. Your sister Joanna died after an anaphylactic reaction. And so to be able to dig deep within yourself after that kind of, personal, just that disruption to your entire family, what is it that made you want to start an organization out of all of that? And what did you want to accomplish when you first began? Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you. Just a quick story, which is also available on our website, fateinitiative.com. As you said, I was moved to start the organization because we quite literally watched my sister die from eating her favorite dessert. She had eaten something that was labeled as non-dairy and vegan. But as most of us know, when you replace cow's dairy in a recipe, what do you replace it with? Well, you replace it with a nut milk of some sort. So that was a little bit of misdirected labeling that she did not see. And she ate it in front of us, experienced anaphylaxis in front of us. My mother, who is a nurse of 40 years, now retired as of last year, had to perform CPR on her own daughter. I was, by a stroke of fate, home visiting at the time when everything happened. So I'll take the words right out of Mary's mouth when I say there aren't a lot of people doing this. So I felt a sense of responsibility to have to educate people in general, various groups, on the severity of it. And it was my dad's idea by him simply saying, you know what, Joe, we need to do something because food allergies kill. Quite just, flat out. He said, food allergies kill. And I was like, yeah, you know what, Dad, you're right. So part of the reason why I called the organization Fate was because everything that I had experienced or worked or done in my life has contributed to what I now am doing with Fate. And that is, my public speaking, having the resources that I have in not only the television industry for exposure, but also in the food, restaurant, and hospitality industry for education. Now, Karen, we had this conversation just prior where I had spoken about when I first started Fate, I wanted to do everything because I felt that I needed to. So it was like, I'm going to talk to schools. I'm going to talk to community centers. I'm going to educate everybody under the sun. And I had this entire list of groups on my website that I would offer to speak to. And it was fantastic in the beginning. We started speaking to schools, faculty, as well as students, which ended up being very popular for us because after we did one school, all the schools in the area started wanting us, which was great. And what I actually had started to realize was that I wasn't using all of the resources that I had. And a friend of mine who actually owns a restaurant here in Toronto had said, hey, can you come speak to our staff on a Monday? Most of the restaurants downtown Toronto close on Mondays. And I said, you know what, why didn't I think of that before? And it happened again. Once we spoke to one restaurant, a bunch of other restaurants started reaching out to us. And I said, you know what, that's my niche, because of the fact that I was able to speak the language of those people. And what I mean by that is, as a chef, we have a specific language when we're working, when we're running our business. It's the language that we speak to the servers and everybody else that's involved. So we know what plate goes out at what time, to make sure the customers are happy, whatever. And I'll take what Jonathan Carroll said earlier, where, you need to tell a story like this and to have people care about something that they may know nothing about. You have to impact them at the ground level. And the fact that I was able to not only speak the language of these employees that literally feed us, from day to day, how I was able to start the story was I watched my sister die eating her favorite dessert. And it's very impactful to hear that, for one, but I think that also comes from my years of just working in, reporting and television, because this is storytelling. So, for example, if you're watching any movie or any television show, the format is always the same. We're introduced to the characters first, then the inciting incident, which sends our hero on their journey, and then not that I'm calling myself a hero by any means, but you need you need a punch in the face, basically, in the beginning, to have people say, whoa, this is something that I need to pay attention to. Because at the end of the day, who really wants to sit in a room for an hour and a half and listen to a guy in a shirt and tie tell his story? Well, no one likes sitting through training in general. I don't think there's anyone that loves sitting through a training seminar. So I try to have our training seminars, forums as I call them, be conversational and as impactful as they can be, which is why I kind of started with a literal punch in the face with our story. So,
thank you for sharing on that level, because I think, the idea that people have to process what they're going through and then figure out, how can I make this information useful to other people? And the discovery that you made after starting this organization, that I have a lane that I can occupy that maybe someone else won't think to use, to be able to speak to a community that you are already intimately connected with in the language that community is used to hearing. And so that feels like something that the audience can take with them, the idea of looking at your own experience and saying, who can I speak to in the language that we all know that will hear me about food allergy and celiac? What specific knowledge do I have that I can bring to bear in these conversations that will allow people to see this in a new light?
Yeah,
And something else that we actually talked about that I want to ask you about here is, you talk about why you think people don't understand how long it takes to make change. I mean, Jen has referred to that, Mary's referred to that. Change in this arena comes slowly. Why do you think it takes so long?
Well, I hear all the stories of what's happening. I'm in Canada, by the way, for anyone that's watching, even though it looks like I'm in New York City at dusk. But in the U.S., and we've befriended Thomas and his family. All of us that have lost people to food allergies have sort of befriended each other, and that's both a tragic thing, but it's also a fantastic thing because we can all scaffold each other, right, Mary? We can all be each other's foundations throughout this thing. To answer your question, Karen, as to why I think it takes so long is because we speak to each other. Everybody in the food allergy community knows what to do. We know what not to do. We know how to approach people, what to stay away from, et cetera, et cetera. But for people that don't live with food allergies, that don't know anyone with food allergies, that have never had to experience it at any capacity, I want to give people more credit. It's not that they don't care. It's they just don't understand it enough to care. Right? It's not an insensitive thing, although there is a percentage of people that are insensitive about it. But for the most part, right, the people that are serving our foods, that are, CEOs of the food companies that feed us and the places that we all love to go, that's not the first thing that's on their minds, right? That is far from a priority for them. Sure, it's part of good business practices, especially when it comes to feeding us, but it is not the first things on their mind. So how do you get to the top of the food chain in that sense? Well, you start at the bottom, right? Almost like a pyramid. You start with whoever's sort of holding up the company or operating the company. So you start at the ground level, all the employees, and then that hopefully makes its way up the food chain, so to speak. And gets to the people that matter. In the case of I forget the story, but there was a girl. It's actually featured on the FAIR website. But there was a girl who went to a restaurant, clearly laid out her food allergies, which was a peanut allergy, and the dinner came to her, and there was peanut in it. Right. So where is the disconnect there? So, I mean, in general, it's obviously education, but what I always also say is you can only speak to the people that are going to listen to you, right? I know that those of us who have food allergy families, we are frustrated because we feel like no one's listening to us. And it's so hard to get these laws passed. And why isn't this happening now when I want it to? And of course, we want things to happen now. But just as all of us have mentioned, it does take patience, and it does take you using your own resources and realizing that, okay, well, if I can't talk to everyone, who's going to listen to me? And how much impact is that going to make going forward?
Thank you. I mean, this seems to be a theme that's run through our entire time together here today, the idea that we have to educate people not only on the nuts and bolts of the issues, but educate them as to what kind of effect that these situations have on the lives of people who have to live with food allergy and celiac disease. And that in sharing those stories, what we're doing is building a community that will be able to actually take this kind of advocacy on a much greater scale. What I want to do in the time that we have left is to open up and to a bit more of a group discussion to touch on some of these things, because so many points you all have raised really intersect here. And one of the things that I think about is that we have heard about a number of developments that actually represent some real movement forward in terms of legislation, in terms of improved advocacy over the last decade or so. But I would love to hear your thoughts on specific challenges that remain and what we can do to actually move forward in a productive fashion.
So, I mean, I'm happy to jump on that first. Some of the things that we're really looking at right now are folks who don't have safe access to food in institutional settings. So we're looking at whether people with food allergies and celiac disease have safe access to food in hospitals, whether they have safe access to food in retirement communities and nursing homes, and whether they have safe access to food in jails and prisons. There have been some terrible stories over the year. There was a young man not too many years ago in Washington State who was arrested on minor charges and held overnight. And he had an allergy, I believe, to dairy, and had disclosed the allergy, was served breakfast containing dairy, and died. There's just no reason for that to happen. We can have the policies and practices in place to ensure that doesn't happen. In hospitals, we have a case right now where a young lady who's currently a senior in high school had an anaphylactic reaction. She was taken to the hospital. She was hospitalized overnight. And on the second day of her hospital stay, after her parents having done everything right to disclose her food allergies, she was served food containing 2 of her allergens and had anaphylaxis in the hospital. We can do better than that. So we're really looking at those settings where people can't just choose to bring their own food, who may be somewhat captive to circumstance and need to have safe access. And that's very much on our radar right now.
No, and that definitely, the idea of, it feels like there are systems that don't talk to each other, like within a hospital, for example, where again, you've got what would come in when you go into the ER, there's a record, there's a chart, but the food service staff is not seeing that. And so if people make last minute substitutions or there is a glitch somewhere in that, how do we improve the quality of how our systems talk to each other to keep people safe?
Right. And one of the things that these lawsuits do is they grab the attention of, this is an issue and we need to rally around this and do this better.
Yeah. Jen, do you have any other thoughts about that? Because you've seen so much legislation pass through.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of emerging issues. I agree with what Mary touched on about broadening the lens to other institutions. One is enforcement. We talked a little bit about this before, that there's been so much work done on legislative initiatives around epinephrine, around food allergy policies in schools, around restaurant training, things that we could spend a lot of time talking about if we had the time. But the consequences for not doing those things are fairly poorly defined, and a lot of restaurants, or say a lot of folks I've worked with in my professional practice, as well as when I was at FAIR, kind of did a cost-benefit analysis and decided they were just not going to comply. And that was the decision that they made, because their consequences of not complying were not that great. The other issue that I'm seeing emerge recently has to do with the food allergy employee, the food allergic employee. And you have a cohort of young professionals who've grown up with food allergies moving into the workforce. We've done, a decent job sensitizing schools and even to some extent colleges, although boy, do we have a long way to go on that. But and this is where sort of the work that I do kind of, ends and Mary's work begins, but what is the role of the employer in ensuring that their employees can participate fully and successfully in whatever their business enterprise is, be it traveling for work, going to conferences for work, and someday we hope even food that is provided within this. Many employers feed their employees, so that's I think an area we're going to see a lot more development in future. And lastly, I'll just say, and I think what Joey said is so important. And I'd say you're a little more optimistic about this than I am. There's a lot of antipathy toward food allergy. There's even, I would say, in some quarters, hostility. It's a life-threatening disease that is not understood as a life-threatening disease. So people with cancer, people with autoimmune disorders, there's a great deal of empathy for what they need. But I think because food allergy, to keep someone with food allergies safe requires the cooperation and involvement of other people, and occasionally the inconveniencing of other people. I think we have been met with a level of antipathy, and hostility in some cases that have precluded some of the more the better solutions to creating safe environments.
No, that is such a huge point, Jen. And it's funny because there's a comment in the chat that made me want Joey to ask you. I mean, this is a huge issue around the issue of keeping people safe in restaurants, right? Because restaurants are places where we all dine. There's an enormous number of people who are affected by food service, what's available, what can we serve, airlines, airlines with peanuts, airlines without, being in a college environment or a community environment. Schools, this is a question where we have all the time, are you willing to have a nut-free classroom? Food is just such a big trigger for a lot of people because of the fact that food is emotional for us. I mean, we build holidays around it. We build gatherings around it. It's something that gives us pleasure as well as sustenance. If you're looking at trying to educate people around how to do food safely, and then also create that feeling of community, what are ways that you're thinking about now? And I know this is a new shift for you, so I'm not wanting to put you on the spot, but thinking about how you're looking at reaching out to people to communicate the full range of the idea that making food safer for everyone doesn't mean that you have to compromise your own enjoyment.
That's a great question, by the way. I mean, in general, it's yes, it's a challenge. Just to backtrack a little bit, just from working in the restaurant industry for many years, at very many capacities. I've done hotel banquets, so I'm cooking for 5,000 people. I've done fast food. I've done food retails, so displays and all that stuff. And throughout the course of my career, even though I was growing up with a food allergic sister, anaphylactic sister, I didn't care. Right? When I was working, I didn't care. If I got a ticket that said, cook this chicken dish, allergy to peanuts. If I got that ticket, I'd be like, oh, great. All right, well, make sure you don't kill this guy or whatever. And that's unfortunately still the way that it is today. Again, I will fully admit that I was that employee, even growing up with a food allergic sister. I'll even tell you something even more funny. Growing up as a family, knowing that my sister was allergic to seafood, we would still do family outings at Red Lobster, right? Because we actually didn't realize. My sister has never experienced a serious anaphylactic allergy in her childhood. She's got the hives and all that stuff, but it was never something as serious as anaphylaxis. A few months after her 30th birthday was when she had that first anaphylactic reaction, and it was her last, right? So anyway, going back, I digress. I'm so sorry, I forgot the question now.
The question was, I think the person in the chat was talking about the fact that when you're doing food service for large numbers of people, you talk about serving banquets for 5,000, yes. You're trying to raise consciousness, you're trying to make the people in these kitchens care, but how do you do that across such big groups of people, a whole restaurant, a whole banquet hall, and still have people leave with that feeling that we've all been cared for? We're not just, we're not just looking at these people. It's not about just asking me to give up something that's important to me.
Sure. Yeah. So when we do our educational seminars, especially in the restaurants, obviously, I'm making sure that I'm speaking their language. So I'll introduce myself as, a television host, and I've done this stuff, but I also say that I've done what you have done for nearly 2 decades. So I know exactly what you guys are going through. I know that when it's a Friday night or Mother's Day or Valentine's Day, the last thing that you're thinking about is safety, right? You're making sure that you're not cutting your own finger, not that, you're not touching the crushed almonds when you're making this dish. That's the last thing you're thinking about because it's so busy. But what I also push forward the fact is obviously using our story as an impact, because my sister died from the food retail business, not because of the food retail business, but because of the lack of knowledge that there was in there. So pushing forward that education is key, because what I also understand is that in any industry, but especially in the restaurant industry, and especially post-COVID, pre-COVID, we're still in COVID, is that I'm trying to tread very lightly here. There's clock punchers, which means there are people that will only do what is required of them at that time frame, right? And then they'll collect their paycheck every 2 weeks, etc. And then there are a percentage of people that actually do love what they do. They care about their jobs. They want to move up in the ranks. They maybe want to own a franchise of that particular restaurant or food retail business or whatever, right? So again, going back to my point of you can only talk to the people that are going to listen to you, right? Is just pushing forward that the fact that you have a responsibility. You know, you are in the business of feeding someone. We were told when we worked in restaurants, you know, everybody goes through their own stuff, but when you're in this building, leave your baggage at the door. I don't know if anyone's ever heard that before, right? So if you're going through something, yeah, it's going to distract you. But when it comes to literal life safety, you know, that's where you have to leave your baggage at the door. Forget the fact that you're there to make your minimum wage and all that. Yes, you are there to work, but you also have a responsibility of feeding people. So if you get little details, you know, about this particular customer, about this particular dish, and it does require you to do a little bit of extra work, the second you take a shortcut or ignore that, the emotional, the physical, and in some cases, the legal ramifications of that are enough to be a detriment to all parties involved, right? So just pushing forward that fact that this is life and death, this is food safety.
Well, I mean, what you touch on, and thank you for going into it in that detail, is, you know, not only is this part of the responsibility you bring to your workplace every day, this is actually part of doing the job you were hired to do. And that, I think, is a different mindset. But that, once again, it is your educational process is to expand the definition of community, to want everyone who comes in for a meal, whether it's in a restaurant that seats, you know, 20 or a banquet hall that can seat 5,000, that you want everyone to leave safely and happily, and that you, as someone who's employed in the industry, can play an important part in making that happen. I think that's a message that people can take to heart, you know, in you know, your industry and frankly in any others. I am realizing that once again, the hour flies away from us. Whenever we get together, we could be here forever, but we've run out of time for today. I want to thank all of today's guests, Representative Jonathan Carroll, Jen Jobrack, Mary Vargas, Joey Salmingo, you know, for not only being with us today, but for the critically important work you do every day on behalf of people with food allergies and celiac disease. We'd also like to give a very special shout out to the staff of Food Equality Initiative for making this and other discussions possible, and for their continuing leadership on the issues at the intersection of food allergy and food insecurity. Thank you for joining us for this conversation on food laws and introduction to changemaking. We would love it if you would join us for our next conversation on Friday, September 17th, where we will talk about food at college. Jen, you're psychic. Until then, have a happy Friday and a wonderful weekend.